Meeting number 8 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 sub 3, the committee is meeting in public for the first hour on the actions of the longest ballot committee in recent elections, and in camera in the second hour to discuss committee business. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Before I continue, I would ask all persons to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. There's a QR code you can follow. Please take care for the health and safety of people here, especially our interpreters. Just a reminder, all comments should be addressed through the chair, but we have an experienced witness here with us. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, raise your hand. I don't believe there's anyone here on Zoom, but if there is, use the raise hand feature. I would now like to welcome our witness for today's meeting from the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer, the Chief Electoral Officer himself, Monsieur Perreault. 5 minutes, please.
Alors, merci, Monsieur le Président, de me permettre de prendre la parole devant.
Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak to the committee. It's a state of the longest ballot during the most recent federal elections. As you know, in September 2024, I wrote to the former Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs to bring to bring an amendment. So I said the same thing when I spoke in the context of C-65. As I said, there were electors and parties interested in accessibility had said that this causes problems for voters because it's hard to handle and that there's a huge number of columns and many candidates can create confusion. Operationally, each ballot box can only hold about 100 of these ballots compared to 1,000 ballots, traditional ballots. So this multiplies the number of ballots that workers have to carry. And these are much more difficult to handle for the workers and the representatives of the candidates who are present. The vote count can drag to a very long time. We saw that until 5 a.m., which has an impact on election workers. So many say they don't want to work where a long ballot would be used. Even though the mail-in ballots were used at Battle Road Crowfoot had mitigated the problem, some electors had still had difficulties. It's not, for me, a long-term solution.
For the various participating candidates were signed by the same electors. This indicates that voters who signed the nomination papers are not supporting the nomination of any particular candidate, but rather the idea of having as many candidates as possible. And this is why I suggested amendments to ensure that voters are limited to signing the nomination paper in support of only one candidate. This restriction could be accompanied by administrative, I would say not criminal, but administrative sanctions, and target more specifically organizers who encourage or incite electors to sign the nomination papers of more than one candidate. However, I'll repeat that candidates' nominations should not be invalidated or questioned if their papers include one or more signature that is also found in another candidate's nomination paper. The committee has heard a number of other recommendations, including limiting the number of candidates an official agent can support, with which I agree. I would clarify, however, that the limit should apply only to a specific electoral district. There are multiple cases in which one official agent acts for multiple candidates in different electoral districts, typically, of course, for the same party, which is perfectly reasonable and acceptable. However, becoming a candidate should remain accessible to Canadians, and for that reason, I do not support increasing the number of signatures. Finally, I would also like to alert the committee to a recommendation made in 2022 by former Commissioner of Canada Elections, Mr. Yves Côté, related to false or misleading information on nomination papers. Currently, there is no provision in the Canada Elections Act to sanction instances where signatures would be collected prior to having identified a prospective candidate. Such a nomination would be rejected if the deceptive practice is known ahead of the nomination, as has happened in the past, both with candidates from the Long Ballot Committee and from other parties, or from parties, I should say. However, if the practice is detected only after the fact, no provision exists currently in the Act to sanction such a practice. The recommendation made in 2022 in relation to false or misleading information in nomination papers would fill that gap and allow the Commissioner to take action. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Monsieur Perot. Well under the 5 minutes, as I said, an experienced witness. So we'll turn to Mr. Cooper for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner, for returning to committee once again. I want to pick up where you just left off in your testimony because I had received a copy of a complaint that had been sent to Elections Canada from Ryan Davies, who appeared before this committee and brought that complaint to this committee's attention. Were you aware of that complaint?
I was not aware of that complaint at the time that I testified before the committee. Of course, I am now aware of the complaint.
Okay. Now, the complaint states, among other things, that there were potential violations of the Canada Elections Act by the longest ballot committee. The complaint includes various pieces of correspondence, as well as a photo of an organizer who was collecting or appears to be collecting signatures in which the candidate's name is blank. In other words, if that is accurate, if the picture is fully accurate, but it certainly appears that the candidate's name was blank, that electors were signing a nomination paper for a candidate that would be then filled in after the fact, which would not be consistent with the Canada Elections Act. So what was the status of the complaint? What happened to that complaint? Do you know?
So all complaints, after an election, we receive thousands of complaints, and whenever they allege a violation of the act, we don't scrutinize to determine whether there's adequate evidence or whether there's actually an offense under the act. We typically transfer that, as a matter of course, to the Commissioner of Canada Elections. So, and she has the mandate to investigate violations of the act, contraventions of the act. And
in the case, and I appreciate that, in the case of Mr. Davies' complaint, was that forwarded to the Commissioner of Elections
so
Canada?
that's an interesting question. She is seized of the information in the complaint. The complaint itself, as I learned after the testimony, and I asked to search for that complaint, the complaint itself was caught in our security filters because of possible contamination of the links. And so other people who saw the evidence put forward, or the videos put forward by Mr. Davies, did make complaints, and the Commissioner.
So just to be, so I'm fully clear, the complaint essentially, Mr. Davies' complaint, went into a black hole. Insofar as it was sent to your office, to Elections Canada, and because of whatever issue, it sort of went into a black hole, is effectively what it sounds like to me happened.
I would not, Mr. Chair, describe it in that manner.
Well, I guess with the greatest respect, and I understand these things sometimes happen, but there was a complaint. It sounds to me like no one looked at it. Is that accurate, or did someone look at it?
So
when did anyone at Elections Canada first look at it?
So the complaint was received, and other complaints preferencing the videos made public by Mr. Davies were received. The Commissioner was seized of that information and the allegations, but if you're asking, the physical complaint itself was not transferred, but she is seized of the matter.
So by being seized of the matter, what do you mean by being seized of the matter?
She understands the allegations.
When did she first understand the allegations that were set out in the complaint? Was it after Mr. Davies appeared before committee?
No, first of all, Mr. Chair, I cannot speak for the Commissioner. What I can say is her office was seized of the issue at the time that, in short time after. We're talking about July, if I'm not mistaken, after the election. And as a matter of course, these issues are forwarded to the Commissioner's office. She receives, just to be clear, from the public and Elections Canada, around 18,000 complaints. 2,000 of which or close to were forwarded by Elections Canada. And as part of that, and there was no significant delay, her office was seized of the information that Mr.
Can you undertake to provide the committee with the chronology of what happened with that complaint, when it was identified, and when it was transferred, or when the commissioner became seized of that complaint? Because it sounds to me like something went wrong with the complaint in terms of what happened on the part of Elections Canada. You would agree? I mean, surely.
I certainly agree that something unusual happened with the complaint, in the sense that there are security parameters around our systems, and if there is concern around the links or documents, they are quarantined. But in this case, the information was also pointed to by other complainants, and they were transferred. And I can commit to share with the committee the time in which these were transferred to the commissioner. I can't speak beyond that. What happens in the commissioner's office, of course, is not for me to speak to.
Thank you so much. I might have exaggerated. You had 10 seconds, but I'm sorry. I said 5 seconds, but I will try to give it back in subsequent rounds. Mr. Wilkinson for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you for appearing. You've been pretty clear about recommendations with respect to unique signatures and official agents. And to be honest, many of the witnesses that we've talked to have similar views to you. You touched in your comments about your views on the issue around the 100 signatures that you need to obtain. Some have proposed that this threshold be changed to 0.5% of the population. Maybe you can just elaborate on why you think maintaining the 100 signatures is a good idea?
Well, I don't think there's any magical number. It could be 75. It could be a bit more than 100. I don't see in what we've witnessed any need to change the number. What we've seen is, I think, a respect for the letter, subject to the allegations made, but not a respect for the spirit of the legislation, which is, in my view, that the person signing on agrees that this particular person should be a candidate, not just anybody, whoever that may be. And I think that's the real issue here, not so much the number.
Okay. You said in your statement that sanctions shouldn't be criminal; they should actually be administrative. But of course, the whole point of sanctions is to deter behavior like this. So, what type of sanctions do you think would be appropriate?
I think a fine would be appropriate. I know that it's sometimes, and there could be a criminal sanction in addition if that's where Parliament wishes to go. My only concern is this, and my advice to Parliament is this, that if you impose a criminal sanction, you raise the threshold in terms of the level of evidence, the cost of doing the investigation, the length of the investigation, and we've seen in many cases in the past where these take years to resolve. They may not get the prosecution because the prosecutor may have other priorities. And at the end, the courts are often more lenient than what an administrative penalty is. So it's something to consider when making prohibitions of this nature or creating violations of this nature.
Okay. When you appeared earlier this month, you talked a little bit about the impersonation ban and that it needed to be updated since artificial intelligence and disinformation have become more prominent. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what the rule is and why you think it needs to be updated?
So right now, it is an offense for someone to purport to present themselves as being the leader of a party or the chief electoral officer. But that's not what deepfakes are about. Deepfakes are about presenting that person as saying or doing something which they have done either in audio or a video. So there's no impersonation that takes place in a deepfake scenario. And I think what we have to be concerned is the manipulation or creating a synthetic content that we see with deepfakes that make leaders or candidates or the chief electoral officer appear to be doing certain things or to be in context that they really weren't.
So what would you propose?
So I think that certainly the offense right now needs to be modified. I have made some specific recommendation to that effect. I've shared that recommendation to the Hogg Commission, which supported, to change the provision to include the misleading. There's very specific language that I don't have in front of me in section 480.1, which currently is for impersonation, and it does not include satire, but it includes impersonation with the intent of misleading electors. And I think the similar concept should be used where it's the manipulation, the alteration of an image or voice with the intent of misleading or interfering with the electoral process.
Okay.
Leaving aside satire, for example. But that's one of several recommendations that I made.
In June, the Quebec National Assembly passed Bill 98, and I guess that enters into force next year. There's a ban in that bill on spreading false information about election activities, the nomination process, the voting process. Just wondering if you think that the Canada Elections Act should be amended for having similar provisions, and if so, what would that look like?
So thank you. Mr. Chair, I did make a similar recommendation, though more broadly worded in my 22 report, and I repeated that in my report in the context of the foreign interference. I do think there needs to be a prohibition against someone who knowingly presents or publishes false information, so they know it's false, and they do that with the intent of entering the electoral process or undermining trust in the process or the results. But it has to be a high threshold of intent and knowledge that the information is false. My recommendation is a bit more broadly worded than what we see in Bill 98.
Okay. How much time? Okay. So the Canada Elections Act right now does not require third parties to submit audited financial statements verifying that no more than 10% of their revenues are used for political activities. Both you and the Hogg Commission have indicated this raises concerns about transparency. Can you elaborate on what that risk is and whether we should be looking at having third parties being required to do these kinds of audited statements?
Certainly, that's been a long-standing concern and one that's difficult to tackle. But third parties may be individuals, they may be groups, and sometimes these groups are funded by all kinds of organizations. And while there are limits and restrictions that they can't use foreign funds, as we know, money is fungible, and it's hard to know where it comes from. And when they report, what we've seen over the years is increasingly third parties report expenditures as being their own. And they're their own because they were given for a general purpose, often for a cause, but not specifically for these particular expense in an election. So that becomes their own money, and it's reported as such, and we don't know what the source is. So my recommendations is that groups be required, groups that raise more than 10% of their revenue from donations, essentially fundraising entities, that they have to have a separate bank account, and that they put those donations there with the source of the donation. So when they use the money for an election, we know where it comes from. And that, of course, also addresses some concerns about foreign funding.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Madame Normandin, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur Perrault, encore une fois, pour votre...
So your presence is highly appreciated. You've already answered a few of my questions in your opening statement, but I'd like to cover things that were suggested by other witnesses before you, because I understand that for the issue of the 100 signatures, there's no appetite on your side to change the number. There are some witnesses and colleagues who talked about a cash deposit by the candidates. I would ask you, is this a good idea or not? If yes, how much? Do you have anything to say about this? The court was quite clear. The difficulty with the deposit is that it's tests the seriousness of people, of not people who have money, but for them it's just income. It's not a test of their seriousness, but it excludes people who would want to participate and for whom an absence of income would make it more difficult for them to do it. So the court decision is sound. I don't think we need to come back to it. Thank you. Another thing that was discussed, rather than having a single official agent officer for a candidate by writing, there was the idea that a officer could not represent a candidate in different ridings, but for many ridings. But in a single riding, where the candidates are competing, they shouldn't share the same team. There's something incompatible with the nature of an election. But there's nothing incompatible if an official officer serves candidates in several ridings. So we often see that within a party. Those people are not competing with each other, they're allies. And everyone in their own riding. So I don't see any reason why we should ban that. Thank you very much. And on the recommendation that seems to get a important consensus, to have the possibility of a voter can only sign a single nomination document, and there could be penalties coming with the after someone has willingly or intentionally collected several signatures for several candidates. Does the idea of canceling the nomination of people who have collected many signatures intentionally or not, maybe the error was in good faith, and also is the delay in processing these things creating problems? Yes, it's an important issue. I think that we should never doubt the legitimacy of a nomination on that basis for the reasons that you just mentioned. And there's the idea of the delays, the timelines that are very tight. Nominations that can happen even at day 21, as we call it, before 2 p.m. So the time is really limited for the returning officer. The returning officer generally doesn't have access to that information. They would have to compare all the nominations and should choose, with that kind of a rule, is this the first nomination that's received that counts when there's a double signing? Is it the date of the signature that determines it? In all cases, it would not be a fair rule for candidates who have not really a way of knowing who signed twice. If it's by mistake that there's a double signature, when it happened, and I don't think that this would be well advised. A ban might have several consequences, and they're not necessarily obligatory. I don't think we should necessarily cancel the signature. There can be sanctions or not. It's not unusual to have laws where there are bans on things where there are no sanctions. But here I'm proposing sanctions that are very mild, but that would principally be aimed at those who incite people to sign more than once. I think that's the crux of the problem, and I think that's what the legislation should focus on. Thank you. That's very interesting. And I'd like to hear about one other thing. I asked a question earlier. Who should we think of first? What's the hierarchy of the various rights that we must think of when we have to make a recommendation at the committee? We talked about the rights of the voters to have a uniform voting system from one riding to another, to have the possibility of voting, the right of people to make themselves candidates, and the right of the electoral voters to have a good working environment. Yes, I'm answering with a bit of a smile because we often say that the voter comes first in our philosophy, but in terms of human rights, the rights are equal and have to be balanced. The right of a candidate is a right that is protected by the Constitution as well. So I think we have to balance the two. I don't think there's necessarily a conflict between both. Okay, I'll wait for the next round. Thank you.
Mr. Calkins for 5 minutes, please. Okay, Mr. Van Popta for 5 minutes, please.
Good, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Perot, for being here again. It's a pleasure to have you and listen to your testimony. We're talking about amendments, possible amendments to the Canada Elections Act to make it more difficult for non-serious contestants to get their names on the ballot. And this is to avoid the abuse that we've seen in the last couple of elections, political stunts, really, orchestrated by a group that calls itself the Longest Ballot Committee. Now, one such change that is being proposed, we've talked about it already, you mentioned it in your testimony, to make it more difficult to get the 100 signatures by requiring that they be unique signatures. Now, if we make that amendment to the Elections Act, would it withstand a charter challenge? Section 3 of the charter gives everybody the right to participate freely in an unfettered way in our electoral system. Would that withstand a charter challenge? We put the same question to your predecessor, Mr. Kingsley. This is what he said. I think amending the Act for 100 unique signatures would sustain a challenge that a challenge would not succeed in overcoming the requirement that there be unique signatures. We want to hear from the current CEO on that.
So I don't speak as a lawyer or a judge, but I do believe that it would meet that threshold. As we know, rights are not absolute. To the extent that there are restrictions here, I think they're necessary to protect the integrity and the sanctity of our electoral process. The requirement would not so much make it harder, but more meaningful, that people would not sign on simply because they want as many candidates, but they would have to turn their mind to the particular candidate at issue. And I think that's the concern here. And I think we've seen that there is a need for some restriction. And if it's not going to be a deposit, which has its defects, then it needs to be something else. But there needs to be some protection against the system being taken hostage. And
I think we all agree that there needs to be something, but my question is whether we would withstand a charter challenge. Mr. Shukevich actually did challenge the $1,000 deposit. Thank you for raising that. In a 2017 case that appeared before the Alberta Queen's Bench, and he was successful. But he also challenged the 100 signature requirement, and there he was unsuccessful. The judge says that's perfectly reasonable. But now we're raising the bar. We're proposing to raise the bar to make it more difficult by saying that they should be 100 unique signatures. And I know you can't read the mind of the Alberta judge, but it would have been a different question put to her at that time.
In my view, it only makes it very marginally more difficult for most candidates who don't rely on groups like that. And so for most candidates, it would not significantly impact their rights. It's only, I think, when you reach a certain level, and now we're at the level of over 200 candidates, that, to reach that number, it would put a brake on that. But the benefit of this measure is that it would limit that without really significantly limiting people who truly wish to be a candidate. And that wasn't the case with the deposit, right? It had a bit of an irrational impact. There's no rational connection, the court found, on the deposit and the seriousness of the candidacy.
Understood. Good. Just a couple of minutes still?
A minute and a half.
Okay, so I'm going to go into something else that Mr. Shukevich said, and his committee has been saying it all along. We, parliamentarians, are in a conflict of interest, making our own rules about how elections are conducted. What's your opinion on that?
And it's an interesting question. I mean, there's no denying that there's an interest in any parliamentarian in the rules that govern their election. I don't think anybody would deny that. I think it's interesting that when you look at the history of changes to the legislation over the last 25 years, two things stand out. There's often an attempt to secure cross-party support. It doesn't always succeed, and it shouldn't be a rule because it shouldn't be a requirement for unanimous consent because that would give a veto to the opposition, which I don't think is fair. But the vast majority of changes have come from really the vast majority have come from recommendations of chief electoral officers, which come from a neutral source, often following consultations, including consultations of political parties. And they're examined in this committee, and they're disposed of one way or another, and certainly not all have made their way to the legislation, but many have. And I think that process is a healthy one. And I think that's something that needs to be maintained. It does not prevent additional changes, and I've seen some very good changes over the years that have not come from chief electoral officers. So I'm not saying there's a monopoly on wisdom here, but the fact that there is a process for a neutral policy intake and a cross-party examination of that neutral policy intake, I think is a good system. It's provided for in the legislation, and it needs to be maintained.
Thank you so much, and I ensured you got the 10 seconds that I took from Mr. Cooper. So, Mr. Lewis for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Perot, first of all, for your service as a Chief Electoral Officer, your experience, extremely valid here, and your extensive testimony and this is the first time I've seen someone come twice to the same study. So I think that's fantastic. And it's important talking about long ballots. You were pretty extensive about it in your first appearance earlier in the month. So I wanted to also talk about the scope of the misinformation and the disinformation that happens. False claims about voting times, locations, procedures, and election results. You mentioned Quebec passed Bill 98 in June, which will enter force next year, so we don't have the information yet. That'll have a ban on spreading false information about election activities, nomination process, and the voting process. Is that something that you, as Elections Canada, then will look and see what kind of results and use that as a bit of a study to see if this can be scaled up?
Certainly, and we share experiences with all electoral management bodies across the country, and we meet regularly and talk about these things. Of course, mis or disinformation has been an important topic over the recent years, especially with the growth of social media and the decline of traditional media. So we do talk about these things. We did see, and I say that in my report on the election, we did see an increase in incorrect information. Now, we monitor only really information as it relates to the electoral process. But we did see some cases that were troubling. For instance, there was a case where a Journal de Montréal article, a fake article, it was an image, said that we had changed the voting day because of lineups, because for 60-year-olds would vote on the Tuesday instead. Now that was very quickly taken down, but it is the kind of thing that is troubling and that can mislead electors and hinder their participation.
I appreciate that, and that kind of protection then would say consequences would happen if you catch somebody. Right now, the laws that exist are really only within Canada. Is that the case? How can we stop not only someone from inside the country doing this, but how can we expand that outside of Canada to make sure that misinformation and what you mentioned it can't be done, because now you're talking about different jurisdictions?
So this is a complex issue. There has to be some nexus to Canada for the offense to be caught. So if somebody's saying something about a subject matter that's done elsewhere shouldn't be caught. But the real difficulty is not so much in crafting the offense, but it is in enforcing cross-jurisdiction these rules. So that will remain a challenge no matter what. That's why it's important to have relationship with social media platforms and to be able to rely on those relationships to take down. And the example I gave, the information was immediately taken down. So sometimes the rules are important, of course, but you need more than the rules to ensure a healthy electoral process.
So the relationship with those who are the companies that are spreading that information, let's say your social media giants, you have that relationship and you're requesting for certain things to be taken down if they're false, and they are responding?
We've never requested for what we call a takedown. We typically avoid that simply because it's seen as state censorship. We make them aware of the problem and the dangers of the problem, and we expect that they act accordingly. And in this case, they did. I know that takedowns have been asked elsewhere, and I think the commissioner has asked for takedowns, but that's not something that we've had to ask. When we've seen, and often simply correcting the information or downgrading the prevalence of the information on the platform is sufficient, and I have examples of that.
Right. And there would be two steps to that. One, for them to admit, yes, we will change this information or take it down, and two, the speed counts. If it's an election cycle itself, misinformation getting around quickly, speed is of the essence too. So is there any way of enforcing or asking for precedents?
Absolutely. And the regimes with offenses are after the fact are not particularly helpful in that regard. They of course create a deterrence, but it's the ability to make the platforms move that in real time that's critical.
And then my final 30 seconds, I'll thank you, because I think in addressing this, you mentioned that flooding the market with the proper information, which is the importance of journalism, to make sure that that's a more supply of information from our independent journalists is important. That's something that stick with me. So I appreciate
Yes,
that.
I think it's important. We've really strived to put out as much as information as possible, correct information about the process in the last election, and we're going to continue to build on that. Increasingly, platforms have their own AI chatbots, and that's both an opportunity and a challenge because they're fragmented. I think it's an opportunity if we flood our website with correct information that they will be caught. So we can use that. We can leverage that. But one of the recommendations that I've made is that AI chatbots be required to point when a question relates to electoral process issues, and increasingly people don't do a search. They ask a chatbot to provide the information. That they be required to point to authoritative sources of information. So in the case of a federal election, that the bot would be required to point to. They could provide the information, but it would also have to direct the elector or point to our website.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lewis. I did promise her the additional 30 seconds, so for 3 minutes, Madame Normandin. S'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais
Thank you very
revenir-
much. I'd like to come back to the the practicalities of the single signature beyond communicating with the voter that they can only limit themselves to one signature. Have you already thought about how this could be done? How do we tell voters if they've already assigned a nomination for one candidate, they can't do another one? I think the simplest way to do it is to make sure that it's very clear on the form, and that we recommend that there is due diligence. Should we change the approach that we use to explain to the voter what the nomination document means? When I'm asking for signatures, I'm saying that it's not a commitment for my vote, but accepting the fact that I am a candidate and that they can vote for anyone else afterwards. Do we have to change the way we talk about the action of nomination? So should that be limited to one person? That the vote must be secret. So it's not a request for support. It's not a commitment to voting for the candidate during the elections. I think it could be indicated clearly on the form, on the nomination form. And I imagine it's a question that you're being asked these days. And that would not change. So I think that we could also make it clearer. But when there's a form that's full of text, nothing gets read. So we have to be very selective as to what we put on it. But that should stay there. I asked the question of one of your colleagues, because at the beginning of the campaign, we may not know for whom we'll be voting. So we could maybe want to have two different candidates who present themselves. So do we not limit that if we ask the voter to sign up to support just one person? Is that reasonable? Because to the rights of the candidate to ask that there just be one signature. I said that it would not. Does it limit the rights of the candidate? Yes. Does it limit the voters' rights to express their support? And I consider that that's a reasonable limit. You shouldn't forget that this administrative procedure was not created as a platform to allow people to express themselves. It's not the objective. The objective is to ensure that the candidate has shown that they've made effort and support. So we shouldn't look at it from the point of view of the voter, but from the point of view of the candidate.
Mr. Calkins for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a couple of quick questions for you, Mr. Perot, and then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Mr. Jackson. In your exchange with my colleague, Mr. Cooper, you suggested and intimated that the complaint submitted by Mr. Davies somehow got caught up in what I would presume is your safety firewall of your email system, and but only fortunately because other people had followed up, and Mr. Davies is a public figure to a certain extent, you were able to get what you needed in order to pass along to the commissioner. So will you let us know, have you asked your systems administrators to investigate and report back to you, and hopefully then you could report back to us what measures you're going to take to mitigate and make sure that complaints that are serious will not be missed this way again.
So, thank you for the question. So, yes, I have spoken to my team and asked that it be examined so that we make sure that if there are serious complaints, that they are not lost because there's a question mark as to the, the security of the link or of the document. So, yes, I've spoken to my team in that regard. I would add, though, as I said in my opening remarks, that in the case of allegations that signatures were opposed to a document without the name of a candidate, that there is no offense under the Act.
That's
and
fair.
that is something that needs to be addressed.
That's fair. I appreciate that. I'm just going to move on quickly here to make sure that Mr. Jackson has some time. Would you undertake, Mr. Perot, to submit to this committee from the last election, the 45th general election, the number of sworn affidavits on a per riding basis that were signed in order to allow electors who could not provide proof of their citizenship, their age, or their address on a riding by riding basis to this committee?
Mr. Chair, electors cannot swear an affidavit to prove their own
Then I want the number of affidavits that were sworn by. I understand how it works.
There are different circumstances in when it was sworn statement is made. It can be an elector attesting to another elector. There's also, when somebody registers at the polls, they do attest that they are a Canadian citizen, 18-year-old. So there's that attestation. So I just want to be clear here, I'm not resisting
Both.
the request.
Both.
So I will certainly undertake to see whether we can do that. All of the documents pertaining to the elections are sealed in bags that are for the 343 districts. There are 77,000 polling divisions, each having their bag. And if they're in there, it would be years to collect all of them without any specific, inquiry into a particular polling
Okay, if
division.
I got back to you then with a subset of ridings, would that be helpful?
It certainly would be, but again, with the undertaking on a best effort, but the implications could be very significant, especially as we prepare for a possible election that can happen at any
Understood.
time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here again, Mr. Perot. I questioned your predecessor when he was here about what it would take logistically and from a staffing perspective for Elections Canada to actually specifically check all 100 signatures for each candidate are in fact unique. He didn't want to comment on your operations now that you run the show, so I will put the same question to you. What, from a staffing perspective, would that take for Elections Canada to be able to do that if 100 unique signatures were imposed as a requirement?
So I want to be clear that I do not envisage doing that, in the sense that certainly this is not something that could take place in the few hours that involve the nomination process, right, and the verification of the nomination process. Currently, returning officers go through the 100 signatures to make sure that there are 100 and that they are attached to people who are resident in the electoral district. That is the requirement. To then compare with other nomination papers is not something that could be done in the time.
So then how would you propose enforcing the 100 unique signatures per candidate?
So I think it's an important question. My view is that this should be enforced in case of organizers orchestrating. If I can use the word stunt that has been used before this committee, orchestrating campaigns to multiply candidates by using same.
I respect that, certainly, but I think the public, is not going to trust the longest ballot committee to police themselves, and I don't think we should as legislators either. So if it's not Elections Canada that will review the candidate signatures, would you support making the signatures public so that then at least the public could compare signatures from candidate to candidate to candidate, and if there are duplications, file a complaint with your organization?
Very quick answer, Mr. Perot.
No, they are public right now. They can be examined in the office of the returning officer right now. I did not say we would not do examination. I said we would not systematically do examinations where we have cause to suspect that there is an activity. And to be quite frank, the activities to orchestrate the kind of initiatives that we saw requires a fair amount of publicity. These are not things that happen under the radar. So it is not difficult to see how we could very well, in those cases, intervene and do verifications and refer the cases to the commissioner as required.
Thank you so much. Madame Kayabaga, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome back. Nice to see you again, Mr. Perrault. I wanted to ask you a few questions and get some thoughts on what you think individuals or entities who assist or facilitate someone else's violation of a provision of the Canada's Elections Act, should they be held accountable under the Act? And if not, can you tell us why?
You may be referring to a recommendation of the former commissioner. I think there was a recommendation to that effect to have a general rule make sure that anytime there's an offense, that people who are assisting in the commission of that offense, that they can be caught under the Elections Act. Similarly to there are provisions elsewhere in other legislation that do that. Obviously, I would support that.
And should the scope of the Canada's Elections Act be extended so that the provisions would also apply to conspiracy attempts, counseling, contravention, or being an accessory after the fact to a violation of the Act?
I think that would be a sound approach, yes.
Okay. Currently, the Canada Elections Act bans third parties from accepting foreign contributions for the purpose of conducting regulated activities, but it does not prohibit foreign entities from giving such contributions. Where do you see the challenges lie within these provisions right now, and what gaps it poses?
I think it's simply a matter of being more comprehensive in the rules, that if we don't want foreign money to come in, that sometimes the person who receives the money may not be aware, but the person who gives certainly is. So you want to make sure, I think Parliament would want to make sure that the rules cover both the person, the entity who receives money, that unwittingly in some cases may be foreign in source, and the person the foreigner who attempts or delivers that money to the campaigns.
So are you saying that the law should be amended to prohibit?
Correct. That was a recommendation that I made in certainly in the last fall. I don't think it was in my 2022 report, but last fall it was.
So we're seeing a lot more campaigns rely on AI to micro-target. How do you feel that Canada Elections is prepared to deal with AI online with misinformation? I know that we had some conversations about this earlier before the election, but just wanted to know what your thoughts are on who's responsible on regulating AI use online, and how confident is Elections Canada that AI is not interfering into elections right now?
So it's a very rich question. AI is not inherently bad. It's a very powerful tool, and it can be used positively and negatively. And we want to make sure, I certainly would want to make sure that the rules prevent the negative uses without preventing the positive uses. I've made 3 recommendations specifically in relation to what we would call synthetic content. One is a prohibition, and we've talked about that earlier, on deep fakes. Rather than simply impersonation. And we've seen some deepfakes in other elections, not in Canada, deepfakes used to mislead voters, and that is very preoccupying. We have seen deepfakes of leaders in the last election, but seemingly for financial fraud, not for misleading electors in their electoral process. But that is something that needs to be addressed. I have recommended and still think it's important to provide transparency when any use of synthetic content should be known to the viewer or the listener. That's something that we need to make sure that people are aware that this is not reality. It may be legitimate to present a synthetic production, but I think awareness is important. I think those who do that in the context of electoral communications should be required to make it transparent. And as I said earlier, chatbots on platforms should be required to point to authoritative source of information. So that's for the electoral world. These are recommendations that I have in mind right now. It is a rapidly evolving environment, and of course, we will need to be on the lookout for changes.
we should also label some of
Yes.
the content. It should be okay. It's
Yes,
a very good
any
recommendation. I
any
agree with you.
synthetic content should be labeled. People should know that this
I
is
have
not
less
true.
than 30 seconds left, but I do want to ask you this really quick question. What were the observed challenges in the counting of the votes during in areas where the longest ballots were used, and what do you think is the future impact of the voting, counting, and spoiled ballots that you're going to see with the longest ballot?
So there's
Sorry, before you answer, is a very brief answer. I'm going to be tough, and maybe this is a good question to bring up in the next round. We'll do one final round. We'll do 4 minutes, 4 minutes, 2 minutes, just so it takes us to noon. For once, I'm being tough on time, but it's a good precedent to start with. And so we'll turn to Mr. Cooper, who I think is splitting his time, but I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to follow up on the complaint of Mr. Davies. It certainly is not satisfactory that a legitimate, serious complaint went into. You don't agree with my characterization of a black hole, but I don't know what else it could be called other than a black hole when it goes into a security filter system and then isn't checked upon. And it really begs the question, how many other complaints raising issues of potential violations of the Canada Elections Act and so on go into Elections Canada's security filter and are not acted upon?
Mr. Chair, I think that's a legitimate question. It's certainly one that I've asked my team, and I think we need to look into that. We need to make sure both that there is security, but that there are means to making sure that if there are serious allegations of wrongdoing, that this not be lost through the security protection. So it's a balance.
Now, respectfully, I do find it a little bit astounding. With the greatest of respect, I understand that there are security filters, but does Elections Canada not have processes in place to monitor those security filters, to check if emails that shouldn't have gone into them are then reviewed and forwarded on to the commissioner or acted upon as they should be, as opposed to sitting in a security filter?
So again, I've asked my team to examine that very
No, but I've
question.
asked you, are there processes in place?
I've asked to see what are the processes and what they can be done to be improved.
You don't know that there are processes in place about Elections Canada's security filters with respect to complaints that are sent to info@elections.ca.
This is the first time that the situation has been brought to my attention, and I
No,
realize...
but it doesn't sound like it is necessarily an isolated case. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that when you have a security filter, that emails sometimes go into security filters that aren't junk mail, and so it just seems to me to be unacceptable that there are no processes in place, because you can't point to any. I mean, it should be pretty straightforward, shouldn't it be?
Again, I've asked that this be examined and that I be briefed on the matter, and I'd be happy to report back on the issue when I next appear.
Well, maybe you could answer how many other complaints have gone into that black hole.
So, I'm not aware of any, but that is something that needs to be examined. I do not disagree with you. It needs to be examined. In this case, as I've indicated, there are two other aspects, but it does not negate the legitimacy and the relevance of your question. In this case, the information, the Commissioner's office has been seized of the
It
information.
sounds to me like it is staggering incompetence. It sounds to me like there is a complete lack of oversight in place to ensure that complaints are acted upon, and I can say it certainly doesn't leave me with a great sense of confidence in how Elections Canada is handling complaints about potential violations, potential serious violations of the Canada Elections Act, complaints that raise issues that go to the integrity of our elections and how they are being handled.
Mr. Chair, with all due respect, I think it's premature to draw those conclusions, but
Well,
it is not. But if I may
premature.
answer, I would like to answer, please. It is not premature to examine the issue internally, to see what needs to be done and to do it to make sure that serious offenses are not, serious complaints are not ignored. As I said, in this case, the subject matter was brought to the attention of the commissioner, and perhaps it was determined that it was sufficient to do that. I won't.
Thank you.
Right? And as I said, in this particular case, allegations of a blank signature, if I could, of a non-candidates being identified is not an offense, and that needs to be addressed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Perreault. Madame Brière, 4 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci,
Thank you,
Monsieur.
Chair. And thank you, Mr. Perrault, for having come here a second time for the same study. I'll let you finish what Madame Normandin asked you. I think we have to ensure that adequate processes are in place so that we don't miss serious complaints. In this case, relevant information were sent to the Commissioner's office. It's important to say so. In this case, it's also important to recognize that the Act does not consider this a violation. It was raised in 2022, and the Act still does not list this as a violation. So recommendations were made in that respect. Thank you very much. The situation that the longest ballot committee created has led us to have these discussions for 4 of our meetings, and I'd like to know if you're thinking that we're focusing too much on these, and if this is the right process that we should be taking to reflect on amendments and what we could do so that such a situation does not recur. Mr. Chair, the committee is free to have its own process. I think it's important that the issue be addressed. I've asked in the past that changes would be made, and I'm happy that the committee is looking at this. And the issue is determining what is the proper balance, that in trying to correct an isolated problem, that we would create unreasonable rules for the community and the potential candidates. So we have to be sensitive to that. And I think that the committee at one point comes to a point where there are more and more candidates, and it becomes more and more difficult. So I don't think it takes very restrictive rules to create effective remedies, because I don't think they want to come back to 30 or 40 candidates again. So I don't think this requires a revolution in the system. I think we're talking about readjusting the existing rules. Thank you very much. It's true that it's a fine distinction, and it's a question of balance, especially when we're proposing various options, various solutions, such as the number of solutions, the deposit amount. I think that you have to keep a norm or a standard that's accessible, because being able to present oneself as a candidate in election is a right. Yes, it's a constitutional right, which has the same value as the right to vote. So it has to be very carefully examined. And I have 1 minute still, but I'm also very interested in the issue of disinformation, misinformation, AI, and deep fakes. So in a general way, I know you've already answered a bit, but is there anything you want to add in that respect? It's really the challenge our society and other contemporary societies face. The information world has just exploded, and with AI, we're moving to another level, and it changes everything. One of the things I recommended in 2022 is to stop in legislation looking at content in terms of publicity or advertising, but to consider it as communication with voters. So I think it's a paradigm change in the Electoral Act where we're ready to have the universe as the traditional means of communication. No longer is the only thing in our world. We have to examine the law and look at the requirements for transparencies, the taglines that identify contact in terms of election communications. Who's selling them? Is it synthetic content? Is it real? And also, we have to play a role to make sure that the information about the process would be communicated clearly and well known. Thank you very much. Ms. Normandin, you have 2 minutes. Thank you. So what's coming out from the committee here is that the two major proposals that people are interested in would be that of a single signature and of a single electoral officer. And if we had to compare both, if we chose one of them, I would say that single signatures is has a dissuasive effect. If there were pecuniary sanctions on someone who would be organizing something against this, and that could have a reverse effect. You were saying that the committee, they'll always want to have more and more people. They're saying we're paying a fine once. Well, we might as well try and have 300 people. But for the official officer, it's a kind of blocking the gate, the entry gate. It's hard to find 200 official officers who would validate that. So between the two, is one solution more effective than the other? Both of them have advantages and also inconvenient effects. So if we have this single, if we would have an officer working for both, these reports, these actions where there's no expenses and no contributions. So being an official agent, so we ask that person to sign as an official agent, but it's not a heavy administrative burden. You just have the person sign after the election and make sure that's true. So I don't think that's necessarily. So I would see both. The advantage of the signature rule is that it can be formulated in a way that targets organizers. And I think that is an advantage. Thank you very much.
For your testimony. I'm sure we'll see you again in the near future, but the committee will suspend for a few minutes to go in camera.